There's a piece of legislation working its way through the various processes right now, which I think is of particular interest possibly to UKIP supporters, maybe to other kind of supporters of nationalism as well, but particularly to UKIP, and particularly someone like Pat Condell. And this is some legislation to do with ritual slaughter of animals such that it conforms with halal and with the, the Jewish requirements on ritual slaughter of animals. And the idea is that up till recently, of course there's been special permissions granted for slaughterhouses to slaughter in particular ways to conform with halal and to conform with Jewish law, which basically means that cows, for example, rather than being stunned first with one of those little bolt guns like the guy in No Country for Old Men uses, rather than being stunned with those, the cows are just hung up by the heels and have their throats cut, and the same with other animals as well. That's basically how it works. So they bleed to death rather than being unconscious and then bleed to death. And up until this point, there's been no legislation requiring that meat that's been killed in that way to be labelled as such. And whilst the majority of that meat, I presume at least, is sold in shops which particularly service Islamic and Jewish communities, a lot of it does find its way onto the general market because, as I say, there's no requirement to label it. And I know, for example, a lot of KFCs, particularly in areas where there are large Jewish or Islamic communities, all of the chicken they use is sourced in this way. It's sourced from animals that have been killed in this ritual fashion. And I should say, of course, it is a method of killing animals that is being condemned by the RSPCA and by various animal welfare organisations. But nevertheless, it is a loophole in the law that allows them to do that. And of course, it also, animals being killed now. The meat, as I say, it doesn't just appear in Muslim shops and stores or Jewish shops and stores. It also appears on the menu in prisons, in schools, in hospitals. And because there's no labelling requirement, or there hasn't been any labelling requirement, you don't really know whether you're eating it. So it's quite likely that anybody who eats meat has at some point eaten meat that's been sourced in that particular way. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning this is there is a piece of legislation working its way through right now which says that all meat has to be labelled if it's coming from animals that have not been stunned prior to slaughter, if they haven't been rendered unconscious before they've had their throats cut. And that's great, that's information is power, so we should be given that information. But it's particularly interesting, and I think it's particularly interesting for UKIP supporters, and particularly interesting for someone like Pat Condell, and I'll say exactly why in a minute, because of the source of that legislation. It doesn't come from British law, even though British law has a very good reputation for animal welfare. We do have good animal welfare protection in this country. This particular piece of legislation is coming through Europe. It's coming from Strasbourg. And was not suggested by English MEPs or British MEPs. I can't remember the name of the MEP who did it, but it's sourced by a European MEP. And in fact, many British MEPs are opposed to the law, opposed to that particular kind of marking of food that's been sourced in that way, of meat that's been sourced in that way. So I suppose the problem, if you're a member of UKIP, and particularly if you're someone like Pat Condell, is there's a kind of conflict of interest here. Obviously, if you are, let's say, wary about Islamic influences, or perhaps a little bit resistant to the idea that Muslims or perhaps Jews would have this special escape clause and not to have to source their meat from slaughterhouses that use reasonably painless methods of slaughter. If you're a member of UKIP or another anti-European, you might be interested in that. But unfortunately, because the legislation comes from Strasbourg, you're also in a bit of a cleft stick there, aren't you? Because if you're a member of UKIP, you're supposed to be opposed to European legislation. We're supposed to be self-governing. We're supposed to be opposing all of these laws and all of these directives which are coming down from the faceless bureaucrats in Strasbourg. But in this case, the faceless bureaucrats are doing something which is kind of restrictive on Islamic freedom, or it could be read as that way. So I don't know, I'd just be interested to know what any UKIP members have got to say about that. I'd be interested to know what Pat Condell thinks about that. I suppose I'm mentioning Pat Condell because in the recent British elections he came out in favour of UKIP, slightly oddly, because UKIP, you know, it's not an anti-disestablishmentarian party, which means it doesn't. It's for the close relationship between church and state, you know, and since Pat Condell is an avowed atheist, that's slightly odd. And it has a number of other policies which don't sit very well with his other stated interests and his other stated beliefs. But as he said in the video at the time, he said this is a single issue election. There is one issue which is more important than anything else. One issue which is more important than religion. One issue which is more important than Islam, more important than Christianity, and that is freedom from the tyranny of Europe. But in this case, the tyranny of Europe is giving legislation which is not something we've thought of ourselves, I'm ashamed to say, is not something that we've been promoting, which is, as I say, the labelling of halal meat and meat that's been ritually slaughtered to coincide with Jewish law. So I'll be interested to know how he resolves that particular problem. That was a really crappy video he made as well, by the way, Pat. I guess he was trying to... I'll say this because in that, you know, when Pat Condell did that video a couple of weeks ago, well, a few weeks ago now, something about angry atheists, you know, he'd come out, as I say, in support of UKIP, and then he tried to excuse it and did various other bits and pieces in other videos. He said, yeah, and in 2 weeks' time I'll be making a video about Jesus. And then of course he didn't, because he's obsessed with Islam, and made a bunch of Muslim ones instead. And now he's finally made a Jesus one, but it's just a bastardisation of zeitgeist mixed up with an old George Carlin stand-up comedy routine.